Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss everything from developing for mobile to building HDTV software, from wearables and robotics to user experience and mentoring. We bring to our listeners everything related to building products and services for the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. I'm your host today, Eric Isaacson, UX engineer at 3Pillar Global. This is episode number 2. And I am extremely excited to be talking with two great guests today. Today we'll be discussing prototyping for clients and stakeholders. One of our guests I have had the pleasure of working with, and the other I hope to work with one day. Please welcome my coworker and fellow hacker Adi Chikara, calling in from Noida, India, and Pam Selle, who is an inspirational developer, mentor, and speaker calling in from the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Adi is a technical lead at 3Pillar Global, and he has a background in leading companies to create market-changing products. He's a problem solver, mentor, passionate user experience professional. He wears many hats here at 3Pillar, leading entire engineering teams, defining and educating on code standards, and involved in the Innovate practice to test and validate ideas. Pam Selle is an enthusiastic JavaScripter and technical community leader. She speaks at local user groups and regional and national conferences on HTML5, CSS, Sass, and JavaScript. She teaches programming as an instructor for Girl Develop It and many other organizations, and co-organizes the Philadelphia JavaScript Developers Meetup with nearly 700 members. She also recently started podcasting on Touring Incomplete at touring.cool, and Twitter, you can find it at touringcool. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Is there anything I missed in those introductions?
No, I think we're good for now.
Awesome. Thank you for coming in again. Pam, I recently saw your talk at Nation.js. It was over here in Maryland, Silver Springs, Maryland. I saw it on Vimeo, so it was like I was sitting in the back. I couldn't really see, but I could definitely, I could hear everything you were saying. I could see the slides, and it was really fantastic. And it reminded me of a lot of the stuff we've been doing here as far as prototyping goes, and I was really intrigued to see kind of how you developed this process. Can you talk about your process of prototyping at Comcast or even for personal production projects?
Yeah, so I got into the idea of prototyping, and really prototyping as a part of the whole user experience, and adopting a strong that you really care about using the tools from user experience from that kind of field to be a better developer and to build, therefore better products. And so I started with a Coursera class on HCI, and I'd highly recommend that class. And that's actually I used the assets from that demo to do the talk, because, since it wasn't for a client or anything, it was fair game to mess with. And so actually I wasn't at Comcast when I wrote the talk, and I was working at a couple places. I worked for Paperless Post up in New York for a bit, and they did user testing, and we did a little bit of prototyping. And then when I worked for a nonprofit investigative news, I guess you could call them a startup, but it's a nonprofit, I did user testing and prototyping there to explore how a story might impact people. And so one of the things that kind of gets into one of the things I think is so interesting about prototyping, in general, that it's a huge kind of, if you drew the Venn diagram of it serves a lot of different purposes. And so you can use, I believe I said this in the talk at Nation.js actually, that I kind of divided into 3 possible categories that you might want to, inevitably a prototype should be used for testing. And actually that's kind of the topic I'm side note, that I'm going around conferences this year is talking about JavaScript unit testing. But in testing in general, in terms of prototyping, is creating something that's generally should be cheap to make, that you can then test in order to test out one of 3 things. You test out an idea or a process. Oh goodness, and now I'm forgetting that third one. Maybe it's only 2. So I think it maybe was process/technique. And I think a good idea if that doesn't sound super familiar to conceptualize that is, say, like CodePen. When CodePen's a really cool website where people make neat little demos in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and people will try out new things. And I know, when I first started messing with CSS animation, that's the first thing I did was essentially I made a dancing reindeer, and so I made my dancing reindeer, and that was my prototype to try out how to use CSS animations. And so prototyping is a great way to learn in many facets.
Yeah, it's interesting that you emphasize the learning aspects, because for me, I do a lot of prototyping here as well at 3Pillar, and for me, the learning piece is really key, because if you're dealing with a product and you have to go out there and you're like, yeah, I got to get this done. It's all about getting these things out the door. But when you're the discovery phase is small, so it's been a challenge to try and get for prototyping as well, to say, well, we need to rapid prototyping because we're testing ideas, and that's the core component. But also, let's learn about newer technologies. Let's experiment with something that we haven't, because if anything we learn from there, we can pull that into our product team and figure out how we can use this in production down the road and be ahead of the curve. Have you found that that's something that you've done with your prototyping?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, that if you're using a tool or technique that you haven't used before, even if it doesn't end up being your production product, that's still a valuable process. So something that we're working on at work, so we're going into deploying basically a web app in an environment where you don't necessarily expect to see web apps. And so we're like finding out what will work on this environment or not. And so when we're discussing this, I'm like, why? So we were talking about React, for example. So React is one of like the hotnesses in the JavaScript world right now. It uses what you call like maybe a polyfill, like a polyfill from one of the Web3 W3C specs for the Shadow DOM. But basically like really fast rendering, like TLDR. React is for really fast rendering. And so we said, hey, I wonder if this would be good for this project. And I said, well, why don't we just put up like the simplest demo page and see if it would work at all? It didn't. So it was a great learning experience, because we a lot of the prototyping is about making it cheap too. I think that's how you make it a good argument for the business, is you say this saves us money in the long run. If we had decided through drawing our software architecture diagrams that we were going to build this whole thing in React, and then we spend a 3-month development cycle on it or something like that, then we found out it didn't work. Well, that was a huge, expensive, very expensive waste of time.
Definitely.
Whereas doing something small and fast ended up saving a lot of money in the long run.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been actually wanting to play with React specifically. I've built a few prototypes here with Polymer and web components. Adi has actually built a really good one with D3. And he was able to get stuff up really fast. Adi, do you want to talk about the process that we have here at 3Pillar and kind of how that coincides or differs from the processes that Pam has been talking about?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are two parts of it. Like, one part is because we are a product company, there's quite a bit commercial aspect to our prototyping. So we like the end result is always some business outcome. So we tend to do more prototyping really for a business outcome goal and less in terms of learning. So at a personal level, I do that a lot, and we do it just for fun. But for the company aspect, we really always do it for some end goal, specifically what the business would be. But where it coincides, definitely the reason we have Innovate as an offering at 3Pillar is price-wise. If you right now in the market, there are less of new ideas and more of what Pam mentioned, making things better. So you don't see something really completely new out of the world, and it's more about what is existing there, how can you make it better, or something add on to an existing process or whatever that may be, but it's all about making it better. And a lot of times when you try to make something better, you tend to fail. That's just how things work. When you try to go about doing that, you try one, the only way to make it better is you try 10 things and one of them works. For that to happen, you can't spend development cycles making that happen. You need something quick to validate if that would work or not, and that's where the cost factor comes in as well. So yeah, that's what I think that's what prototyping in the industry is heading towards, and at 3Pillar we're trying to achieve as well. Really, really quick, fast, like interactive prototype that can easily convey to the either the stakeholders or end user what we are trying to build and what we're trying to convey. This is really a step up from a wireframe or mock-up. We're talking fully fledged working prototypes, just at really lightning speeds, something that can be validated, or validated in a sense, yes, you go forward with it, or as important as no, we need to change the idea. And one of the important goals that we do in Innovate is not just validate and say no, also validate what's next. This didn't work, but we learned from it, and we know, the next thing we want to try out in this process is XYZ. So yeah, that would be, a bit of high overview of what we do here, as well as where I believe it coincides, and it's slightly different from what the industry is doing.
Right. So, I mean, prototypes are it's a pretty loaded term, I find, when I talk with clients and stakeholders. There's a lot of discrepancy as far as what they would feel a prototype is. So what do you guys think a prototype is to you? It sounds like we're all on the same page here, but if you were going to define it, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, the key, it is so hard to communicate with stakeholders who haven't gone through a prototyping process before. I always think the biggest danger is that they think that you tell them you're going to build the whole product in a quarter of the time.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not what you're telling them. But I guess from the perk is that I do think that once people understand what it is, they kind of get it. And especially if it's done in the way so you show where the business value is. So when we're prototyping, we say, hey, at least one of the rules I have is that you have to throw it away. That's one of the rules that the business has to understand, is that we throw away our prototypes so that, literally they live in a separate project area, so that, if there is code share, it's intentional and not unintentional. So a prototype is a small, probably extremely, just from the nature of it, probably extremely buggy version to prove an idea, a concept, or a process is how I would define a prototype. So Adi, what would you say?
Yeah, I would second that. I think challenges-wise, definitely not confusing a prototype with the end product, and not confusing the timeline itself. I think stakeholders somehow understand that the production will be different, but somehow think that the timelines are mixed. So like if you have done the prototype, the timeline to the production decreases somehow. It might have an effect on it because you have some understanding now, because you might actually, in some cases, technically do a prototype to see viability. But most of the time,
it can also make your timeline actually more correct. That its impact on the timeline is that you have a better idea of what you're up to. I mean, software estimation is like an academic discipline these days. Like literally, there are papers written on it that people in master's programs doing, about how we do software estimation and how we do timelines, and we are not good at it. That is the long story short.
Yeah, and more, I think you actually validate your timeline if you set it up. So
you could save a lot of money in the long run, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the important part is just focusing on the business problem we're trying to solve, and just really validating that. Not, I've seen in the past people get too much into details of the thing, as you said, bugs, trying to really lose focus on that. That's a problem.
Yeah, I have also seen prototypes go too long, and I'm thinking about a particular thing, and I'm like, wow, this person has spent like a month on something they're calling a prototype. Like, that's like, if you're working on one prototype for a month, that's a red flag to me.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that.
That's a very long time for a prototype.
Because when I started here last year, and when I started, we had longer prototypes like that, and we learned very quickly that the timeline started getting smaller and smaller and smaller, because you were actually starting to build a product. And that's one of the things you talked about, Pam, in your talk at Nation.js, was you said that a prototype, and it really stuck out to me, you said that a prototype is not the first iteration of your product, right?
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people see it, and it was a learning curve for me coming on. This was a new position where I'd be doing prototyping with the UX team. And, Adi had a lot more experience when he came in doing this than I had. But it was interesting because our timelines got smaller and smaller, and now we're at a repeatable process where it's very short increments.
There's one more thing about prototypes, as in when you start, you define the business outcome, but a lot of times you have to define one more aspect as well. Like, are you building the prototype to actually validate an idea with your users? That's one way I've seen a lot of prototypes go. Are you trying to validate a technology? I think, Pam, your example of React. And the third one, which I feel is a lot, and I would say the most commonly used is, you want others to kind of buy into your product. It's actually, that it will work. You have kind of done your validation somehow else in terms of market research, and at this point, you really want to buy in from your users, from your other stakeholders. And that's the one with the maximum smoke and mirrors as well. But that's the most fun as well.
Yeah, I mean that's your demo prototype really. Like that's where it's it's what you would kind of want to build, say like a hackathon, where you just it's all about the demo. But yeah, that's an interesting. I like that point of separating user validation from almost like it's like stakeholder validation. It's I really like this phrase I heard recently about kind of encouraging people and getting people on board, and they say building the castle, and so that you have to. There's the story about it, because I just love the story, so it's not long. But it's that when Walt Disney was building Disneyland, or whichever one there is in Florida for the first time, he was building an amusement park in the middle of a swamp, which is, actually, if it's the first real amusement park, like besides, like carnivals and whatever, first like stationary kind of amusement park. And he wanted to build it in a swamp, and people were like, what is your deal, you crazy man? And the first thing he did in terms of construction was to build the castle at the center. And so like that was once you show people and you build the castle and you say, this is what we're going to do, maybe it's, I like think, product development that way, of that it's, and then you say like, no, really, we can do this really, really great thing. And if you believe in the dream, if you see the castle, it's going to make the whole process go a lot better.
That's a great story.
It makes it makes the work worth it.
So what we're saying is make the coolest thing first and then go with that.
If you're driving for a demo, I think you're saying, right? Like
that's like the kind of thing, like when you're doing a demo that you're actually building them the castle. Yeah. That you might want to show, say like it's not, you aren't showing what your MVP would be. Like whereas for user validation, you probably would go with your MVP because you're doing so minimum viable to do like the very least that you need to do to provide value to your customer. For the building the castle, you might want to do the smoke and mirrors to say, oh, and then we can add, this component, and we could do this, and, these are all these, like, possibilities, and then almost the user validation is separate from that, because you have to prove that they're worth doing, but you also want to prove, you want to, not necessarily prove, but you want to inspire the stakeholders that, this project is, if you validated the idea, that you're ready to start somewhere, but you give them an idea of where you could go.
Yeah.
Right. And how, for you guys, how does this affect like how you code? Like, I know that Pam, Adi, you guys, and myself, we're all like into standards and enforcing the best practices for things. It's like, how does this affect like for those listeners out there who want to prototype? They may take their own, like, oh, well, in Rails, I do testing, so I'm going to do unit testing, which is something I don't do for prototyping.
Right, for a prototype, yeah.
So
and I mean, that's fair, because it honestly actually makes a lot of sense. So if you think about it this way, so the reason we do testing, like, so, integration testing, unit testing, and is to improve the sustainability of the software over time. If the entire point of a prototype is to throw it away, you actually don't have to care about that. You don't have to care about the sustainability, because it can go stale, and it can, in a year not work in Firefox, and like that's totally fine because you shouldn't be using it. It shouldn't be your production code.
Right.
Yeah, I don't remember ever writing any unit tests for any a prototype. So yeah, that's a valid point.
Yeah, I found I'd even go as far as using image maps, which is something I don't recommend for production.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah,
just
literally
chucking in stuff
if you
that's
have
not.
the design asset, just throw it in there and put a clickable area on top of it.
Which brings me to another thing too, like, as far as the tools that you use, there's different ways to prototype. I know it's not as prevalent in the front end community, but in user experience, you talk about writing on paper napkins, doing all sorts of different types of prototypes. Do you find that you ever do you use a combination of these, or do you go right to code?
Yeah, I would say it depends on what you're trying to build. Like if you're trying to build something which is interactive, then you have to write code. If you're trying to build something which is purely visual, like I think an example was we're trying to build a new interface, just a look of it, and wanted stakeholders to buy into the new look. We just needed plain Photoshop imagery for it. So it really depends on what you're trying to build.
Yeah, if you're doing just like that example, if you're doing just a redesign and you want to make sure that, like say you want to do user testing and make sure that if you're moving the menu items around, the people can still do their jobs. Say if you had like a frontline application or something like that, I think that's a good point. But I mean, part of the reason I lean toward code is because that is where I'm faster, and I do. Probably between them is really kind of either code or paper. Like I do think paper prototypes are really neat, but at the same time, I always feel like if I'm spending so much time on arts and crafts while it's fun, I actually would be faster if I just work with some code and throw up a basic, say like iPhone theme or something, and then just roll with it.
Yeah, so do you find you would do that more like if you were working, like pairing with a designer or something like that on a prototype? Do you find you would do some more of the drawing, or even something like Axure or Just in Mind?
I would like to do the drawing just because I wish I had that skill set, and I think it's really fun to work with people. And of course, that's actually an interesting question of when you're working with other people with different skill sets, that you do have to modify what you do, just because if I was working on a prototype or something recently, and basically when I was sending it to this one particular person to show like what I was thinking, and this was kind of a redesign kind of thing, I would take a screenshot of what I was working on and then send it to them, and they would send me like comments like it was a design file. I was like, no, it's not a design file. Like you're asking me to change code and deploy this to the little staging environment we had. Each time you want to like change a word, that's not valuable. You aren't looking at it like a prototype. But that's just I don't know. That's just kind of an example of almost like the kind of communicating with people with different expectations. People are used to seeing the polished Photoshop document versus really like if this word can be different. It's about kind of seeing are we going in the right direction? If not, then change. If so, carry on.
Right. So I know we've recently formalized the process for a lot of this prototyping with code when we're doing that. Adi, do you want to speak to that, how it relates to what Pam just said?
So I think one key point is we in our company we have people who are just faster in code than drawing, and we do the same thing like. It's easier to like almost all people have like all design guys have skills on paper drawing. I have never used Adobe Photoshop, but I still can draw really good on paper. So because of that, I think that's a much more common skill set. Our processes are really on paper and then straight to code. That's what we're doing in terms of within 3 pillar. And that's working, I feel. Clients are so far, what we have done internally, we see it's really working well. We have got very good response from our clients, as well as some of our internal projects. So, it works, at least for us.
So, we talked a little bit about this, but, if you're working on prototypes and, how do you involve, like stakeholders or clients in the process of this so you can get better iterative I guess, sprints, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, it is just kind of hard because it's all, I mean, I think we'll probably talk about this in general too, but just a lot of prototyping is, how you set expectations. And so I do think it is like a learning curve thing that once a person kind of understands what you mean, that the expectations are adjusted. But yeah, I think for me, we work more with, say, product development for our prototypes, and that honestly for a lot of it is, we work with them in part of the prototype is serving, say, the process justification, and that's actually information for engineering, so that we can then give the product person a better idea of what's possible and how long it will take to do what's possible.
Is there any overlap in that, where the engineering gets to see the prototype before it's actually complete?
Oh, you mean, yeah, we generally have just kind of, for one project we're working on, we just kind of have it set up, and it's constantly updated, and we actually do drive-by user testing. So we have, if engineers are chatting, we'll say, hey, like, have you seen the prototype yet? Would you come look at it for 5 minutes and poke around it, and we'll just watch you and see what you failed to do. Because if the heuristics, so like the kind of heuristics are kind of like the understanding of how things work, kind of like rules that people know, like so it's a lot of them built into the iPhone that are pretty good examples. But so if we're building this on a new weird environment, did we do good heuristics, or did we make no sense? So we do the drive-by user testing, and so it's constantly looked at while it's in development, and not definitely we don't really do the build unless it's like one of the prototypes that takes like an hour or a day. Then it would be kind of silly to break up the prototyping cycle. But if it's one of the one that takes like a week or so, have people look at it throughout and say, hey, this is direction, just all about constant feedback. I mean, that's about, prototyping and kind of the user experience philosophy in general too.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point too in your in your talk, where you said, I think you referenced Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, it's the most accessible intro to how to do user testing, and really kind of intro to what user experience is about. Yeah,
and I mean, as far as like, you are not your users, you emphasized. So like getting people who would actually may use this product as something that we try to do. Sometimes we get pushback from stakeholders or clients saying, oh, well, we don't want to invest in paying people to do stuff or whatever. And we work out certain
really, that's an
things,
interesting feedback, because I would usually think that it would be more of like a fear thing. Like, people
it's
have
rare,
this
but it happens.
Fear of showing things that aren't finished. But I mean, paying someone for a user test, you bring people off Craigslist for like $15. It's not.
Yeah, that's a misconception too, right? That people think, oh, it's expensive. Oh my gosh.
No, you can do it for free too. You just like are like, do you have a cousin who would come to the office and we'll give them coffee from the break room? Like, it's not. That is a false blocker.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
For sure.
So,
go ahead, Adi.
Well, hey, coffee is not free though. But
free-ish.
Somebody pays for it.
It's a sunk cost. You had coffee anyway.
So my point would be one very important bit. This is for products in general, but really for prototypes, it's just that much more important. Having clear decision makers, like as you mentioned, if there's a product owner there, you really need. Stakeholder wise, it really need to be one person who can really say yes or no to it. From it could be, if it doesn't matter how big the team, if you have that decision making happening, that's fine. What I've seen in the past is, like, depending on stakeholders, the stakeholders might be like 5 or 7, and one of them is the clear decision maker, which actually what would happen is the team who's building the prototype and the decision maker would really work together closely, almost like every second close or however that might be, to build the solution, and then it would be shared with the overall group at quite frequently. It might be daily, weekly, whatever that is. But having that process in mind, so you really share everything with as many people as possible, but at the same time have clear decision making happening, so you don't slow yourself down, and you like capability of taking an input and act on it rather than taking an input and discuss it. You really go wrong when you start discussing within your prototyping stage and not doing the prototype itself.
Yeah, it's almost I've seen that, and you can get into the kind of the black hole of the nitpickery almost of of misunderstanding what the point is. It's almost like the longer you discuss, the farther away people get from the actual goal. I mean, I'm known to walk into meetings in general, and if it wasn't clear from the outset, I say, what is the goal of this meeting, and why? What do you want to be done by the end? and honestly, like about maybe like 30% of the time I do that, we're done in like 10 minutes, and it's a really awesome technique because they realize that they just need to have really kind of a conversation and not a whole discussion about God knows what.
Exactly, yeah. I think that would be an important part. In terms of user testing, I think that's quite important. That should really be happening as, again, a cycle thing. As soon as you're building it, in some projects I've seen it that happen daily. Like there was quite an interesting example I was looking at where these guys actually set up their prototype environment in a retail shop. So they had their computer set up in the retail shop itself. They were building it, and while they were building it, they were just showing it to people who were just walking around, and that was their user testing: build and test, and that was really awesome. So if you could reach that, definitely do that. But if you can't, physically be right next to everyone, at least have it, at some frequency.
Yeah, and I think it's about always. I'm always about meeting people where they are, and that you're doing something rather than nothing. Like, so when we're doing our drive-by user testing in the office, that's definitely that's not my personal like perfect world, because I'm drive-by user testing with engineers, and my engineers you're generally going to have power users, and so it's the thing of I can like. There's so many people who they'll use, say, they have a smartphone that they've had for 3 years, and then they learn something just by watching their friend, and so then by being friends with a power user. So it's actually like that person who's not so fast on the uptake, who's probably closer to not that they aren't fast, it's just that they don't invest in it. Like a power user has this obsession with when I get something new, like it's just even if I'm staying in a new city or something, the first thing I do is put down all my stuff, maybe take a nap, but then it's let's go walk around and figure out literally the lay of the land. And power users do that with products, but I think your power users are about generally on the larger scale, usually say about 10% of your user base is going to be power users, so that 90% is really who you also want to make sure you're user testing. In the ideal world, but something's better than nothing.
Yep.
Definitely. I mean, we've had it where we're user testing and we find out that there was one particular prototype where there was 2 people in the organization who knew everything about the product, and these other people were
so then they already know everything.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see the tests and what people are looking at. From different perspectives to different types of users and personas. One of the things too that I've struggled with these is fidelity, and fidelity can mean many different things, but a lot of times people expect it, like we talked about, where prototypes are not a product either. People expect when they see it, oh my gosh, I need to have, why is this black and white? We need to have some images here, some detail. And it's not the point. How do you guys set the expectation of fidelity, or do you?
Yeah, I guess I don't know what you mean by fidelity. Like, fidelity to me means either the financial company or loyalty. So what do you mean by fidelity?
So when I say fidelity, I mean the detail of it, the visual design. A lot of times.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll call that veneer sometimes.
Okay, that's actually a good name for it.
I think it's I don't have a good answer for that, and I think actually, people who are actually, I'm a developer, and so I'm a user experience curious, but I won't call myself a user experience professional because it's a really, really interesting field and there's so much to know in it. But I think it's, good for people involved in all parts of the engineering process to have an interesting user experience. But actual, user experience people who know research techniques, know how to set up a test, I think they have a better understanding of that. And I think my opinion is that it has to do with test setup because, and it's, the two-way of you have to set up the test so that they understand what's going on, but so that you don't influence them. So in a proper research sense, there is a way to do it to kind of help them, and I think it's also, when people have comments on the veneer, it's something that passes really quickly in the conversation. Once you say, oh, that's not what we're working on right now. Here's, the task I want you to walk through, blah, 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 blah. And you just carry on with the user test and, and just let veneer fall by the wayside. Because I think it also is sometimes people do get confused too. I'm kind of pro either all the way veneer or no the way veneer. If you put, place kitten in there, I feel like you almost confuse people more than if you just put FPO for placement only. Because people are like, what is your, why is Nike going to have kittens on the front page? I don't get it. So whereas if, just filled in fake stuff, then you can, if it looks fake, then they expect it to be fake, that kind of thing. Oh, now I understand what you mean by the word fidelity. You mean hi-fi, lo-fi.
Yeah.
Okay. I finally just got it. So, how you can, and I was saying that I think that it has to do with test setup and that also that, I think you can kind of either go, very simple, no shininess, or if you're going to go for it, especially I do this when it depends on the designer I'm working with, but a lot of them are used to being expected to do, high shiny, very shiny designs. And so it's this is how it would look like when it would finish kind of things.
Yeah.
And so then that's high veneer.
I would again put this on the business outcome, assuming that, if I'm trying to take an example of a car, whenever you see these new Auto Expo prototypes, you always see them as really, futuristic looking things, which are really good looking, but when they come to production, a lot of things change. So if that is your game, if you're just trying to, get the buy-in from people, and then you get the highest fidelity possible, and if it's just you're trying to validate something, and nothing really else, then go the lowest. Yeah, I think there's no point going middle. Either go all the way or just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess too it comes down to, does it serve the purpose, like you said, and the business outcomes, if that's the case, or does it, like you said, Adi, sometimes you're testing to see if a technology is viable. Does it serve that purpose? Because it can be distracting, as Pam said earlier too. In some cases. Mm-hmm. So as far as that covers the veneer and the hi-fi, lo-fi, but as far as data too, this was something I struggled with initially doing these types of prototypes. Was lorem ipsum just doesn't cut it, right? So how do you guys deal with data when you're coding these things?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, so if I can, I'll try and, a lot of JavaScript projects, inevitably you're either interfacing with your own API or a third-party service API. Yeah. And either way, you can probably mock something out and just create, a mock asset and literally just save it as a .json file and then consume the static asset. And so that's what I've been doing lately for single page applications of just, it's not even a database, it's really just a static JSON, because that's what you're going to interpret, your API response as. So I just cut out, bothering to build a fake API. So I know some people like to have fake APIs, and I know there's actually also some services where you can generate a person response, and they're free on the internet, and I have to relook them up. But I know when I gave the talk at Nation.js last year, it's one of the things people mentioned was that there were these services, so you could because it's I guess people also just get tired of making up fake people. I don't know how you can ever get tired of that. It sounds pretty fun, but making up. One of the ones I've been working on where I was doing a demo app for just a side project. I made all the street names flowers, so I just picked a theme and went with it. But, I guess some people get tired of making up their fake data. And so there are services that will make up your fake data for you too.
I'm with you on the making fake data. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's fun. But
Adi, what have you done with the prototypes with data?
I think if I've used full DBs as well when it was actual data intensive applications. So there were a couple of ones which actually the entire point was selling data. Their business was relying on selling data. If I can, imagine when Twitter initially did a prototype, maybe they must have used some kind of DB as well. But so if you're data driven, then go with a DB. If not, flat JSON file all the way, nothing else required. So those are the two cases.
Definitely. So do you think that there's a time when it's not appropriate to prototype and you just go right to product? Or service in some cases?
Well, I would say...
Yeah, I don't know. Probably not.
Maybe in one or two instances, maybe if you're building a space shuttle or something, which basically if you do a prototype, the cost would be just too high. You can't really do it. You just go straight to building it. Maybe that.
That's an interesting point.
But even then, I mean, those are actually like industries well known for making prototypes because it is so expensive to build the end thing. Like there's like this great picture of like when business started to understand the value of prototyping from, I believe it was the 60s, of prototyping what airline seats should look like, because you actually had to make sure if people need to get out of the plane, can they walk down the aisle, is this like creating that kind of experience. It would be so much more expensive to install a configuration that you hadn't tested in every plane in your fleet than to make something out of cardboard to make sure that it works. So I think really for me, the only thing I think would be maybe not a prototype is really like if you're extending a current application, and even then probably if you're building like a new web page that's like is a new section, maybe not. I think also I have worked on a product before where they actually didn't have a prototyping process, but I think it was one of those ones where it was highly user validated already, and there weren't really any gains to be had by doing a process prototype. So they'd already had kind of their user validation. They were building kind of a new product vertical, and they done their own kind of stuff to make sure that it worked. And even then, I guess they did do a little bit of prototyping in a way that there was a period of testing for just like actually, I mean, it was just a QA process, honestly, that I wouldn't really count as prototyping. And so that's one where it really wasn't. It was building a new feature into an existing product that was already user validated. Like that was kind of okay. It's kind of okay.
Yeah, I think that's the only example that I've run into actually is where they already have all the user experience information. They have the testing
and they're just ready to go.
They're ready to go, yeah. So someone prototyped before you got there is the problem.
Oh.
So yeah, I mean I kind of agree with that. I mean, when Adi had said about the space shuttle, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then now I'm starting to think like, well, you could prototype different ways. There's so many different ways to prototype other than the way that maybe you and I or Adi go through this. So it's interesting.
I think, but there would be two parts to it. Like, because when you're building a product, you're constantly thinking about solutions as well and trying different ways. And I think this is where Agile comes into play, where while you're developing the product, you try out X, Y, Z and keep changing till it gets to a stage where you're, okay, I can release this. So I wouldn't consider that prototyping though. I would just consider that development cycle.
Yeah, that's just development cycle, or maybe like a word for that would be rapid feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that is interesting because we talked about how prototyping is kind of difficult to define, and I think that's one of the things that does make it difficult to find is that people, because we end up using a lot of the same language, but ultimately that's why I do like the throwaway rule, because if you aren't throwing it away, then it's not a prototype. it's a decent line in the sand for me that, if it does not pass that line in the sand, then it's not a prototype. Then you're working on a product. But if you are going to throw it away, then you might be working on a prototype.
Yeah, it's a question that always comes up to with engineering teams. Oh well, how can we utilize the prototype code in our production code? And you always have to explain. Well, there's it depends on your definition of a prototype, right? Our definition doesn't serve that purpose.
Yeah, and I just like the rule just because it just keeps things from getting hairier later. Mm-hmm. I'll look at source code from the prototype just to see how they did it. But generally, pretty much whenever I do that, I always decide, oh yeah, they did it this way because it's a prototype. And that is a terrible way to do it in production. Mm-hmm. They did it just, very messily so it could work. And I want my production code to be, well tested, well documented. And, mm-hmm. Prototype code does not fulfill those requirements for me. And so it really isn't portable because it's not well tested and not well documented.
Yeah, it's not stuff you show off on GitHub for sure.
Yeah.
As far as I
have mine on GitHub, but they have big, big bold letters that say this is, this is smoke and mirrors. There's plenty of other projects people can look at if they want to see not prototypes. So.
Yeah, and that goes back to setting the expectation, right? You need to really set that expectation right away. So is there any repeatable processes you came up with along the way, either one of you guys, as far as for your own work with the prototyping?
I'd be interested to hear what you all have to say, because for me, I feel like my prototypes, I've just gone through many different kind of situations for them, and so I really don't have one kind of singular process of I think about it if I, and we're actually talking about this for other purposes, but building kind of a static website workflow, so that we can have one workflow that's repeatable for many projects and for internal projects, since we do CI. Mm-hmm. But, since every project is a special snowflake, the CI for each one is different. So we kind of want to change that and have kind of a workflow that's multi-purpose that you can just say, this is a static website workflow. And so that would work for our prototypes, because generally when we're doing smoke and mirrors for them, they're, static HTML, JavaScript, CSS. Just for us, since I talked about how I lean away from using a backend mm-hmm. For prototypes, for using a database or anything. So we are thinking about it. We don't have it built yet.
Right.
I would say after a period of time you can get to repeatable processes, though at the same time, because we're using the word prototype a lot of times, you're doing something different. You're doing something new. So you'd have to, kind of adapt to it accordingly. Mm-hmm. At a more high level, one repeatable process that we have come to is trying to, whatever you plan to do during that cycle of prototype, you can make that repeatable. And what I mean by that is, if my process within a given prototype is solve a problem, build it, share with stakeholder, that cycle, and this is a 2-day cycle, I can make that repeatable for a given prototype, say for a week or 2 weeks or whatever that duration is. So you could do that. So and this is coming up with basic things. I the design sprints idea by Google Ventures and all of those guys. You could take that and try to make that smaller, as I say, make those daily sprints almost, and in that sense you can make it repeatable. But at the end of the day, you just have to see what you're building and just adapt and change accordingly.
Yeah, it really is actually. Maybe that's the commonality we have, is that really the only repeatable thing that I care about is the continuous integration, which could also be, framed as the feedback loop. That's really the repeatable thing in prototyping, is you will show it. so therefore, that's that's the most automatable part. Is that's what's repeatable.
Right. In your talk too. Sorry, go ahead, Adi.
No, I was just saying the other part which I found repeatable is problem solving, and that sounds a bit weird, but the way if I have a given problem, come up with 10 solutions, finalize to 1 or finalize to 3, that process of how to come up with the best possible solution in X time, I think that is also repeatable in a sense, because what I've seen prototypes fail is when you spend too much time in solving a problem, and that it just becomes not a prototype anymore. So maybe that's another one where you can repeat.
Okay, so do you mean like showing multiple options for a solution, or or time to solution?
Yeah, so like if you're solving a problem, yes, try to come up with say 10 solutions. Bring it down to 3, share those 3 with stakeholders, then implement the one, that kind of situation.
Yeah, so making that decision quickly. Yeah, I do like that.
Yeah. So that's another repeatable part. I guess you can apply to multiple prototypes.
Yeah, definitely. So, like, as far as your talk, Pamela, where you talked about using Express.js, and there was some, Node and some back-end pieces as well as the front end. Do you find that now you've moved more towards the idea of just a straight static HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and maybe use a quick back-end like Firebase or put in some Nginx or Go Instant as your...
Yeah, I mean, honestly, for what I've been doing lately, just because of the stack stuff is, Express is a great, very simple server, and I'm using it as a backend for actually another website I just built for a side thing. It's just so easy to write a server in it, and that's why I did it. And also, you know what? That was a talk for a JavaScript conference, so I had to talk about some JavaScript code. But I mean,
True.
Lately, and then some other projects I've been working on when I'm working with more, because I do a lot of Ruby development as well. When I work with more Ruby folk, we tend to use Middleman for static site generation. And I was actually looking into this for JavaScript about looking for static site generators, and I realized that it's almost a little bit of an oxymoron of like, why would you use a static site generator if you were doing JavaScript and HTML and CSS? So I think when I talk about making that kind of repeatable CI workflow, we're probably going to go with Middleman, which is a Ruby solution for that, and that's how we'll get things moving quickly and get that kind of making a build process basically. So Grunt for the build process and Middleman to generate static sites.
Nice. And Adi, you've been using mostly Nginx and totally static stuff, right?
Yeah, like I personally, when I'm doing prototypes, I try to avoid language specific code. So even in production, even the Node applications I've written, I do not use Node servers. This might be a personal choice, but I found because I'm heavily involved into security and backend things, it's not up to the mark yet. Maybe I'm speaking out of term or maybe out of this talk, but what I use normally is Nginx for servers, simple as that, nothing else, no matter prototype or production. And within that, if I need some kind of backend language, depending on what I'm trying to code, it might be Node, Ruby, or could be some Python as well. If I'm trying to, that just depends on what I'm trying to build. But I think JavaScript, HTML, CSS front end, that's static fixed, definitely. Don't really have much choice there. And the server is fixed to Nginx, nothing else. And anything behind that is, if needed, pick a language and go with it. Interestingly, I don't know if it's because I said JavaScript is the only one in front end. I did do a prototype recently which was written in C and used ASM.js to run it in the browser.
Oh,
so,
cool.
Nice.
Yeah, that was something you can code in other languages and do a prototype for the browser.
Yeah. And that's true of a lot of languages now. So.
Yep. So if someone wants to try out prototyping, you are not stuck with JavaScript. You can do whatever you want.
And then you can run it in the browser and just use your compiler.
Yeah, we've had prototypes too that cross over to like where the demo is not just about the application, but now you're demoing like somebody walking up to a poster and scanning some barcode. So sometimes it's like that's just a piece of your actual demo. So sometimes it's like, well, we have to figure out what's the presentation of it as well. And like as far as Express and its lack of defaults for security, we're because I used Express for several prototypes prior. Not so much anymore. More leaning towards static, just straight HTML, CSS, JavaScript now. But
yeah, so maybe that's the way we're moving. Because the more I do them, the more it is generating static sites.
Yeah, I find
just as simple as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it for heavy interaction, I'm typically plugging in Angular or Polymer, and for stuff that's not so interactive, I'll just use vanilla JavaScript for the functionality. But we're hoping. I think it's pretty solid. I'm hoping to get Chetan. I'm butchering his name. Karande, a former coworker of mine who spoke at FluentConf about security, to come on and talk about Node.js security specifically. So,
that'd be interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be a fun conversation to have. Hopefully, Adi, you'll be able to listen on that as well. To come and chat with him.
I would be the critic on that then.
Totally. It's great to get all of the ideas out. Is there anything you think we missed on prototyping at all?
I don't know. I feel like we had a pretty good discussion.
Yeah, this has been really, really awesome. So, Adi and Pam, is there anything you want to share with listeners out there? Something maybe you want to plug, or resources that you'd like to share?
I mean, I'll always plug my blog is thewebivore.com. So on Twitter, I'm Pamasaur, the Webivore.
Which
so
are awesome names, by the way.
My spirit dinosaur. So I plugged. I write on the Webivore about once a week about various anything, but it's generally related to technology. Then of course we also with a few friends of mine here in Philadelphia, we recently launched a podcast ourselves. So if you want to check it out at Turing.cool or on Twitter at TuringCool, it's called Turing Incomplete. And we're still getting up to speed. There's 4 of us, and we pretty much jabber for 45 minutes or 30 minutes to 40 minutes. So just check it out and give us some feedback on what you want us to chat about.
Are you guys on iTunes and Stitcher?
Yep, we just got on iTunes. I don't know about Stitcher yet. That's probably soon.
Okay. And Adi?
Yeah, well, if you want to find out more, probably you can find me on any of social networking or any other site by handle name ADI-ADS. And other than that, 3Pillar as an organization, we are heavily involved in Innovate. We have separate Innovate labs. So if anyone out there want to try or validate an idea, contact us or one of the sales guys, or we'll get in touch. Something like that. I'm not a sales guy, so I can't do that pitch, but engineering wise, we are awesome. So find us.
Nice.
All right, so that wraps up today's episode. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until then, dream of large models and small controllers. See ya. This episode comes to you at least in part through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3Pillar Global. 3Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia. 3Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences, and they were recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplace list of 2014. You can follow 3Pillar on the Twitters at 3Pillar Global. To find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com.